Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Susan Abdul-Rahman, a distinguished pediatric researcher, educator, and clinician with 25 years of experience in academic medicine. Dr. Abdul-Rahman's remarkable career includes serving as the Marion Merrill Dow Missouri Endo Chair and Professor of Pediatrics in Pediatric Clinical Pharmacology, directing healthcare innovation at the Children's Mercy Research Institute, and leading an NIH-funded T32 fellowship program. She now serves as Chief Scientific Advisor for a Kansas City-based technology startup. Dr. Rahman's leadership extends globally with roles such as Chair of Missouri Medicaid's Drug Utilization Review Board and Technical Advisor to the World Health Organization. She has garnered funding from prestigious institutions like the NIH, FDA, CDC, WHO, and holds numerous patents, including FDA-cleared medical devices. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Abdul-Rahman.
I think, can everybody hear me? Do I need to move this a little bit? Thank you guys very much for the invitation to join you. When Sarah asked me to present kind of a status of maternal pediatric pharmacology research, and I asked Sarah who the audience was, and she mentioned it was a lot of folks that are junior in their career and their trainees. So I didn't want to just provide a status update. I wanted to talk about maternal pediatric pharmacology research from a perspective that I feel would have been helpful for me early in my career. So bear with me, we're going to look at this a couple of different ways. We will touch on training, projects, infrastructure, because all of this together make the landscape of pediatric and maternal research. And we'll start by laying the foundation. Start by laying the foundation of kind of historically where we've been, where we are to date, and how to be a little forward thinking about where pediatric maternal research is going. So let's just start with what got us here, where we are, what the current landscape looks like. And I'm starting with NICHD because they're the biggest funder among the NIH institutes for pediatric and maternal research. And the takeaways from these two graphs I have for you here are that the competing grants, the numbers, the amount of investments that are being spent is going up. It's appreciating with, as we see with other things, with, what do you call it? With, what's that term for, with inflation, sorry, thank you. But if you look at center grants, if you look at training grants, and if you look specifically at SBIR, STTR, which is kind of along the lines of innovation and new development, those things, while slightly going up, are reasonably plateaued. So in those areas, we are going to see a little bit more competition. We don't see the same acceleration at the rate of inflation that we do with competing grants. The other thing to take away is that, you know, in 1998, more than 10 years ago, we're talking award rates that are about 1 in 4, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, and now they're below 1 in 5, whether they're targeted or untargeted grants. So that's kind of plateaued off as well, but you have an understanding of what the likelihood of funding is. Notably, the likelihood of success for funding is not the same everywhere you go. These are data that I pulled from NICHD for their funding by state. And you can see that the funding is heavily biased towards the coasts, so California and Massachusetts, with a little bit more of a challenge obtaining funding in the center of the country. And it goes beyond just location. If you look at their funding, again, by institution, you'll notice that more than half of the funding is received by less than 10% of organizations. So what this should do is just set the expectation of where some of the challenges may be and get you to think creatively about how you might secure or pursue funding. NICHD is not the only institute that funds maternal and pediatric research. And if you look at R01 funding On the left-hand side, you'll see that we've got maternal and pediatric research funded by NHLBI, NIDDK, NIAID, and NCI as some of the top institutes. But again, the money is not evenly being distributed across indications across the board. It heavily favors hem-onc, infectious diseases, neonatology, so specific subspecialties. Again, understanding what the landscape of funding is very important as you think about what to pursue. This study from Reese I found very, very interesting. And I think for many people that have had challenges in getting funding for uncommon conditions, this is not going to be surprising to you. What Reese did was took a look at funding from fiscal year 15 to 18 across all of NIH for pediatric research indications. And they compared the funding to disability adjusted life years, so the cost of that, years of life lost, and hospital charges. And your mind can kind of intuitively put a line of unity into each of these graphs. But what you see is that there are some conditions that have a very high burden that are not getting a lot of funding. And there are some conditions that don't have the same cost or burden that are seeing a lot of funding. And they broke it down even further if you go into their supplement for this paper to look at pediatric research areas that would appear to be overfunded based on disability life years and the costs associated with that, and funding areas that seem to be underfunded based on disability adjusted life years. So having an understanding of where the money is going, where the money has been lacking is very important as you think about constructing the grants that you put in. When we look at pregnancy and lactation, we see that institutes across the board fund pregnancy to various levels. Please note that the y-axis here is on a log scale, so some of the funding is actually quite small. I will point out that the lactation spend relative to the pregnancy spend is relatively low. You could see in most cases it hovers about 10%, and there are a large number of institutes and organizations that haven't funded lactation research in the past 10 years, at least according to NIH Reporter. And the money that's coming in for pregnancy and lactation is broadly distributed. So there's money out there, but it's not just going to investigators in the US. We're seeing that money being distributed globally. When we look at pharmacology, specifically in clinical pharmacology trials that might be industry-based or federally funded, you can see that the children are in the green, and that is going up. It's not going up at the same rate as overall clinical pharmacology studies, but there is representation of pediatric studies among all clinical pharmacology studies, and those numbers at least are trending upwards and they're not going down. And although the numbers are much smaller, we're also seeing pregnancy and lactation studies represented among the trials that we see reported in clinicaltrials.gov. And reassuringly, clinical pharmacology publications are also on the rise across the board. And then when you segregate it out by pediatrics, by pregnancy, and by lactation. However, not everybody's doing a great job of translating that research into practice. This is another study that was done by Reese, and it's a relatively small time frame, but what they found was that of the studies that were registered in clinicaltrials.gov, the probability that the results would be published in clinicaltrials.gov within 12 months was about 13%, and the probability of publication at 48 months was only about 50%. So what we've got is a situation where we're always challenged with respect to identifying funding. We need to make sure that those metrics are made public and made available. And if we're not publishing, we're not also stimulating additional potential for research dollars. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on where we are now, because most of you can go into these databases and identify what currently active funding is available for pediatrics, for maternal pregnancy and lactation. There are a number of them that are available to help find resources for you. But what I do want to point out with respect to what's available now is maybe to get you to broaden your thinking beyond traditional funding streams. So this is a nice application from challenge.gov, which puts out challenges as opposed to funding per se. And you can see that they've had at least one maternal challenge there as well. So a different strategy for competing for resources by addressing challenges that the government is posting. I would encourage you guys to take a look at this site. It's actually quite interesting. And then don't forget that as you're new and coming into the field, and struggling to identify where you might enroll, collect data, analyze data, that there are ways to tap into existing data and existing specimens. And the DASH Specimen Hub deposits data and specimens from pediatric and maternal resources and can be accessed by anybody with the appropriate request. So other avenues to kind of generate resources to support a research program. So what I want to spend most of the time talking about is how to think about what's coming down the pike and forecast where research might be coming. I love this Wayne Gretzky quote. I use it all the time: skate to where the puck is going, not where it's been. So looking at the historical data is great to get an idea of what the current landscape is, but can we get a sense of where we might expect additional funding down the road? And I'm going to argue that you can do that. You can get it from administrative data, you can get it from legislative data, and you can get it from regulatory data. And I know that when you hear that, a lot of times it's like, oh, yawn, I don't want to look at this information, but I'm going to try to encourage you about why it's so important to look at. So administrative data, how many of you are looking at strategic plans that are being put out by the NIH, by NICHD? How many of you are looking at annual reports that are being put out by private foundations? These kind of documents are going to telegraph the path of these institutions to give you a sense of where the funding might be going over the next 3 to 5 years. What I think is even more important is looking at legislation. And I'm going to have a bunch of slides that I'm hoping are going to convince you of this. I'm going to show you kind of just the public law, talk about some relevant provisions, and demonstrate how it impacted maternal pediatric pharmacology research. And I'm going to do that because even though we're going to look back a little bit, I want to convince you that staying abreast of legislation is incredibly important to get a sense of where the money is going to be going. So skating to where the puck is going to be. And let's start, I'm going to start with the Orphan Drug Act that happened in 1983, just because it touched a lot of pediatric lives. Let's take a look at some of the provisions that were in that act. I mean, this was meant to incentivize drug development for rare diseases. They offered 7 years of marketing exclusivity, 25% tax credits on R&D costs, waiver of FDA user fees, which can be in the millions, expedited reviews and research grants. And look at what happened after 1983. The number of orphan drug designations went up exponentially. If you look at the table there, industry realized that they could conduct these trials at less cost to them than for non-orphan designations. And biotech industry funding has been increasingly going up on the incline, even in excess of what we see with the NASDAQ and the Dow for the past 15, 20 years. So significant investments have been made in the rare disease and orphan drug space, stimulated in large part by legislation. In 1994, the pediatric labeling rule came out, and what it basically said was FDA may approve an indication based on pediatric PK and safety. And all of a sudden now, instead of having to do these large studies, if we could infer a similar response pathway, we could just do PK and safety. And that led to the federal funding of the Pediatric Pharmacology Research Unit network, which was around for 15 years and largely responsible for facilitating or providing infrastructure for pediatric PK studies. So from this ruling, a number of things happened, including investment in infrastructure for pediatric research. With the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act, their pediatric exclusivity provision, 6 months of patenting and market exclusivity was made available. And so look what happens. You're looking at studies here from 2007 to 2012. And what you're seeing in blue is the investment for any particular drug. We've got about 50 drugs here total. If it was in red, you're seeing a net loss, and green, you're seeing a net return. And look at just how much revenue is being generated relative to the investment cost. So by providing legislation that makes exclusivity an option, we saw an increasing number of studies being done in children to the benefit of industry. We also started to see the infrastructure change in industry. So where we might have had a lot of Model 5 organizations before, where it was a lot of adult teams bringing in pediatric specialists on an ad hoc basis, There are now Model 1 and 2 organizations where you've got pediatric clinical pharmacology nested in the organizations themselves. Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act was also another boon for pediatric pharmacology research. They directed DHHS to establish a pediatric drug development program. It created OPT at the FDA. It directed NIC to expand research for pediatric cancer models. I'm showing you some text there from the actual act, which shows, look at that, $200 million for fiscal year 2002. So knowing this was coming automatically gives us a sense of where the money is, how much money is appropriated and where it might be directed. From this came the Pediatric Trials Network, which is still in place today, again, an infrastructure-based organization to facilitate clinical research. And this was the genesis of the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics. So now opportunities in pediatric and maternal clinical pharmacology at the FDA as well. They were there before, but now we've got them crystallized in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics. The Rare Disease Orphan Product Development Act, I put it in here again because it touches children. $25 million for each of the fiscal years of 2003 to 2006. A lot of money now being invested in specifically rare disease and orphan disease products. And then the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, which authorized FDA to require pediatric assessments of some drugs and products, and just look at the impact that had on FDA labeling approvals. And every time we see a graph like that goes up, we know that there are individuals in the pediatric pharmacology space that are engaged in academia, in industry, at the FDA, conducting these trials, designing these trials, reviewing these trials. It doesn't mean that things don't change, and we want to be aware of that as well. So in 2023, we saw a couple of documents that came out from the FDA saying that PREA requirements have resulted in an increase in pediatric labeling, maybe not necessarily with the incentive of BPCA. And the FDA may say, you know what, we're going to dial back written requests that are submitted if they are able to finalize this document. So what does that mean? Will that change the investment that industry has in pediatrics? It's unclear, but we need to be aware of changes that may be coming down the pike. This is another one. So for FDASIA and part of Creating Hope Act provided for voucher systems to allow drugs to move through the FDA review process easier. But the US Government Accountability Office in 2020 said, we're not sure that these pediatric review vouchers have really been all that effective. And so again, a foreshadowing into potential changes that we might see coming down the pike. 21st Century Cures was incredibly important with respect to the investment in research, both pediatric and maternal. It authorized funding for these areas. I mean, look at the amount of funding authorized for precision medicine, again, relevant to clinical pharmacology, brain, cancer, moonshot, and regenerative medicine. And these are committed dollars through 2026. It was also responsible for constituting PregLac task force, really now focused on pregnancy and lactation, alleviating the burdens that involve enrolling pregnant mothers into trials, enhancing data sharing, improving privacy protections. You could see that that was one of the reasons the funding for Imprint became available. And we even see a change to the revised common rule in 2019 as a result of 21st Century Cures that no longer included pregnant women among vulnerable populations. So staying true to their word about making it easier to engage pregnant women in research, in clinical pharmacology research. There's also now a prioritization process for drugs, and you can see the proposed timeline that's been laid out by NACHD as it relates to this. Again, as we start to think about drug prioritization, we start to think about areas of research that may be relevant over the next 3 to 5 years for pregnancy and lactation research. It's interesting to watch how people respond to some of the changes that take place legislatively. So in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act came out, and it was intended to make drugs more accessible to the population. However, there's a provision in there that suggests for some drugs, for some single source drugs, they may allow negotiation for prices even if they're still on patent. And pharma has been very critical, and many organizations have been critical about this, saying that it's disadvantaging industry. And you can see this passage here that says the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act puts the progress we've made towards treatment for children in the US at risk by forcing companies to make hard decisions. So there are things that are seemingly unrelated to research that may have trickle-down effect that we need to be aware of or pay attention to. And finally, I want to touch on just a couple of other provisions that are out there that we want to be aware of. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. Look at the investment that it made. $9 million for maternal health, $5 million for training in obstetrics, evidence-based integrative health services, $10 million. So while they read as appropriations for improving the care, they are also appropriations for evidence and best practices, which again relates to research. And if you look at Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023, you see again a lot of money being appropriated for maternal health research, and not just at NIH, but HRSA, DoD, CDC, and SAMHSA as well. They trickle down beyond the federal government. I'm formerly from Kansas City, as you guys heard, and you can see in 2023, Governor Parsons just announced new investments in maternal health as well. So as you are seeing these changes happen at a national level, start to look at what's happening at a regional level, a statewide, and a local level, because there may be investments that are being made. It didn't hurt that Governor Parsons was probably prompted by the March of Dimes report card that gave Missouri a D- as it relates to maternal health. But really interesting incentives to get even state legislator to invest in research. And I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on devices. We don't traditionally think of device legislation as relevant to pharmacology, but especially for those of you in the pharmacometric space, a lot of what you do, especially if you are innovating in pharmacometrics, may fall on the device side, not on the drug side. And you should be aware of some of the advantages. So the Medical Device User Fee Modernization Act of 2002 means if you've got a medical device for children, you're not paying user fees when you submit to the FDA. There's been additional incentive through the Pediatric Medical Device Safety Act that established pediatric device consortia grants, which make money available to help you develop technology for children. And we ourselves have developed technology in the pharmacometric space through some of this funding. So something to be aware of. And they're also making the process easier. The whole idea of allowing you to get through the FDA with a little bit more facility has been stimulated from these acts as well. So finally, I'll touch on regulation, and I'm not going to go through all regulation, but I'm going to give you just one relevant example. So if you look back from 2018, there was a guidance from FDA that talked about physiologically based PK analysis. And in that guidance, they say the decision to accept results from PBPK analysis in lieu of clinical PK data is made on a case-by-case basis. So now, just like when we were talking about kids and not having to do a full effectiveness study, but maybe safety and PK, here now we may be able to use PBPK in lieu of clinical PK data. And if you actually look at the bottom right, in 2021, this was used to support the actual approval of a topical generic drug product. So there is real application to comments that are coming out from the regulatory agencies. And what has that done to PBPK? Look at the growth of PBPK from a standpoint of publications. The blue bars on the upper left graph are PBPK publications. The green are just overall PK publications, and the orange is overall PK and the green is overall science. And look at the rate of escalation of PBPK relative to the other two. You could see at the bottom graph, it's broken down by where the application is taking place at regulatory agencies and pharmaceutical companies or in academia. The growth of pediatric PBPK simulation follows the same trajectory, as does the growth of peripartum PBPK simulation. And again, for applications that are both for maternal, for the fetus, and for safety and efficacy assessments as well. If you look at where modeling and simulation is being accepted at the FDA, You can see that it's with CEDAR, with CBER, with CDRH, and in a number of different areas. So there's a lot of opportunity for modeling and simulation with respect to activity at the FDA. So key takeaways I'm hoping you'll get from this presentation is that when you look at past and present funding patterns, I think it can help you shape expectations. I think we need to be realistic about where the funding is going, what type of funding is available. It may help to inform your strategy for securing funding, whether you think about who to partner with, whether you may shift slightly in the overall focus of your research. I would like you to take away that there are non-traditional opportunities that can support research programs. There are challenge opportunities. There are existing databases that are available to provide additional resources and support for the programs that you're doing. And I really hope you take away that tactical reviews of legislation, of regulatory administrative initiatives can offer insight into where the money will be going in the next 3, 5, 10 years and help you think about how to shape your career to take advantage of those resources. So that is all I have. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Sue. Ben from Adagen. So one quick question is, can you comment a little bit about how researchers and also pharmaceutical industry can also shape, right, how the government is thinking about legislature and also all the rules, right, that's getting set forward?
So that's a very interesting question. I'm going to actually ask you to pass the mic to Dr. John Wagner over here, because he was sharing his experience earlier, and I would like you to kind of maybe share what you shared with me, and then we could talk about the 21st century cures and your experience.
As a junior faculty member, I had worked with the American Heart Association. So in full disclosure, John Wagner, I'm a pediatric cardiologist and pediatric clinical pharmacologist by training. So I was recruited by the American Heart Association to do some advocacy work on Capitol Hill for the 21st Century Cures Act. So I'm a resident of the state of Kansas. So I met all the Kansas legislatures, both Senate and the House of Representatives. And as we started the meeting in each individual office and talked about 21st Century Cures Act, everybody was on board in terms of passing it. Everybody agreed, both sides of the aisle. And after the second office we went to, I went to the executive director. I'm like, why am I here? Everybody's on the same page. Why don't we just get this done? So I'm very pragmatic being a cardiologist. I'm like, let's A to B to C, let's go. And the executive director said, young grasshopper, you don't know how politics works. Representative Yoder has to support representative from Indiana who has to support this piece of legislature from the representative in Washington, and on and on and on and on. So for me, it was a real big aha moment. Even though people are on the same page, there's just an integral web of how the process works. So I think you have to take those small wins when you can get them, and eventually this passed. So.
And that's a good example of one strategy, which is talking with local legislators. Let me caveat this before we talk about some of the opportunities, is that you may have restrictions based on the organization you work for that allow you to have conversations with legislators, to lobby with legislators, but it can happen at the local level. You could talk with your local legislators. It can happen at the national level. So one example is I'm currently on the NICHD's PREGLAC Implementation Committee. And as part of that, we will be writing a report to Congress that will say, hey, here's what hasn't been done. We're not doing this well, or we need congressional oversight or congressional investment to make these things happen. So to engage when you're asked, to lobby when it's relevant, to talk to your local legislators is all incredibly important. Now, I'm sure that there's a mix of extroverts and introverts in this room. And as an introvert, it always makes me cringe when you tell me I have to go network with somebody. It's not my safe space. But I think when you hear of legislation that's taking place, actually, I don't know if I think the slide is missing. Yeah, here, I may not have shown, I may have glossed over this. So this is there are health policy foundations And this is a good example of one that I want to point you guys to if you want to see other legislation that's in process. And so what you can do is now rely on policy sites to help you identify policy that may be relevant to you and proactively identify who you can communicate with about this. And you'll see things in here like Mama's Act and a bunch of other things that have been around. They may sit in the Senate or the House for years and may need continual pushing. So those are a couple of ways to do it, but I would strongly caution everybody to make sure you understand what your institution's rules are. If your institution is getting federal funding, they may have some special rules that are put in place as well. But a lot of it is just conversation and being aware of what's coming down the pike.
Stefan Schmidt, University of Florida. Nice meeting you again.
Nice to meet you.
Question. So you mentioned that or in the introduction was mentioned that you had also ties to WHO in an advising function. Can you maybe comment, because you spoke a lot about, US efforts and legislature, on what that means on a global scale? WHO, IMI, EMA guidelines, ICH guidances.
Yeah, I'm not the right person to speak to EMA. I don't have as much experience there. I think hopefully we've got maybe colleagues here from FDA that can speak to that. WHO is, with my experience, is highly indication driven. So I've worked with them in the tuberculosis space, in the HIV space, and in the malaria space, actually in the praziquantel space as well, or so the antihelminthic space. And they are looking for folks, for technical advisors, for technical resource people that have the skills and the ability to do pharmacokinetic modeling to drive dosing recommendations for their guidelines. Those typically occur as part of guideline development groups, as technical advisory groups, and often you need an introduction or a way in. I've been working with them probably for the past 15 years now, and it's because somebody made an introduction to me as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there. It's not a research opportunity per se. It's not going to be dollars that you can invest in a research program. But if you're interested in applying modeling skills and expertise to a global challenge, then that's certainly a place to do it. There are some caveats there. When we think about modeling, we think about precision. In that context, precision may be the enemy of being able to implement relatively straightforward dosing strategies. So there has to be an understanding of what the right way to model is, and then how to adapt that so that it actually can be implemented on the ground floor in these various countries. It's a great question.
Really interesting, something that we probably overlook far too much, thinking that, gee, we have a good idea, certainly someone will pay for this. But to follow on John and that conversation, are there grassroots organizations for this? I'm thinking of and are they effective? I'm thinking of like ACT UP from long ago in the AIDS community, that I think there was a debate about whether that group was effective. But are there grassroots organizations, and are they effective? And if so, should we be involved?
There are. So a lot of the maternal health initiatives have come from grassroots organizations. Grassroots organizations that are specifically pharmacology related, I'm not sure if I'm aware of them, and I would welcome if anyone else in the audience has some knowledge about that. That would be exciting to hear. But yes, especially when we're talking about health-based initiatives, we certainly see that coming from patients, from patient advocates, from patient groups.
This on? Yes. I frankly suspect that it's going to be hard to get any grassroots visibility for modeling. Frankly, the bigger question: maternal fetal health, imprint. We're not going to see differential equations on the evening news. But so I think that would be the focus if there is an opportunity there to be involved. It's not on the modeling as much as just the clinical application side.
And again, maybe on the evidence basis for the decisions that are being made. But I share your same view, and that's why I presented a lot of this legislation. Is when I was going through, I was like, wow, it's a great idea. It affects a lot of children. There's disability associated with it. Surely it's going to get funded. And the reality is that in many cases, it's not. And understanding kind of what's been funded and why, and then what drives funding decisions is incredibly important. You know, we saw, I don't have it here, but we saw the same legislative push for mental health translate to resource dollars for mental health. So I try to touch on things that were pharmacology or maternal pediatric related, but you could see this across the board. The dollars are being driven in large part by the decisions that are being made at a very high level.
This is Matangi Gopalakrishnan from University of Maryland. Thank you so much for providing overview of to follow the money to get the grants. So my quick one question is, you touched upon the devices from a pediatric perspective. Could you please just elaborate on what you mean by devices? Is it the algorithm that you're talking about, or what?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I've been involved in pediatric device development, both physical medical devices and software development. And you know, as we start to think about precision therapeutic software that might be made commercially available for clinical use, that is going to go down the device route. That is going to be viewed by, now I also understand that there are conversations within FDA. Where does it belong? Does it belong at CDRH? Does it belong at CDER? But those are going to be viewed as medical devices or companion devices in conjunction with a drug if they're paired. And so understanding the medical device landscape is incredibly important. I was part of the MD SHIP initiative, which is really intended to facilitate pediatric device development and passage through the FDA. And I could share with you I've shared my experience with the FDA for device clearance with other colleagues in the device industry, and they were stunned. But I said, you know, I basically had somebody that was holding my hand the entire way who would call me and say, okay, you're going to be getting a letter. Let me help you understand what it says. Here's what you're going to have to do. And so there is significant push right now to facilitate device development as it relates to pediatrics. I haven't heard as much on the maternal, but surely on the maternal fetal side, it must be there as well. And so understanding that process, that pathway, where it's going to help you, I think may not be from a resource standpoint. The grants that are coming out of the device consortia are small. They're meant for human factors and usability testing and marketing and that type of thing. So on the business side of things, in fact, a lot of the funding that we saw that you're going to get on the device side is going to be small, incremental, innovation-based type funding, which is, you know, to quickly support the next go, no-go decision. But what you should have is kind of not necessarily a straightforward path, but perhaps a facilitated path through the FDA. Few to no user fees, which is a big deal when you're trying to get something cleared by the FDA as well.
Sue, great talk. I have more of a comment as opposed to a question, but one thing I noticed when you're talking the front half of the talk was the graph of clinical pharmacology funding at the NIH. And your subsequent slide was clinical pharmacology publications. So it was a pretty much flat line for pediatric funding. When we look at publications, it's a dramatic rise. So the question is, where's the funding coming from to result in those manuscripts? Is it alternative sources or is it internal funding? The other comment is, should we be really broadcasting that pretty widely? Like, we're pretty good at resource utilization maybe too. You know, we're still being productive at a pretty low cost. And if you gave us more funding, that line may be even better in terms of the product.
That's a really interesting observation. And I think it's an interesting analysis that I don't know if anyone's done. We'd have to take a look to see how other disciplines fare as well. Obviously, I think some of this is being driven by industry. Some of it's being driven in the academic sector. You yourself have a number of highly funded studies, and you know that multiple publications arise from a single individual study. So that could be part of it as well. And there are analyses and reanalyses that are done. So I don't know where the kind of imbalance is. But you're right. I think we do try to make the most of what we've got. We have, especially as pediatricians and obstetricians, maternal health folks. I mean, we typically have not had the resources that we need.
Yeah, can you maybe also comment on the use of pre-competitive efforts to establish platform models? Because, oftentimes, if you go to a regulator, you're in a tricky space that you want to understand your drug for pediatric indication. At the same time, you want to know how it fares relative to the gold standard in the space. So you're, oftentimes required to study more than one drug at the expense of the sponsor.
Mm.
And so, that becomes in part like overly burdensome. And so if you wanted to really make the process efficient, I think you want to have like a platform model that is reusable.
Yeah.
But the burden of establishing that platform model should not be entirely on the industry sponsor.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, I think you're getting a little outside of of my realm. I mean, so you're talking outside of the existing platforms that are currently being used, the development of new platforms? I'm going to defer to you, to Rob, to other experts in the area. I don't know. I think if you're getting the return on the investment on the industry side, it should the whole burden be on industry. I think the only opinion I have on that matter is we see a lot of these platforms and models being developed where it is not open source, it's not being shared, they cannot be combined. And I think if that is the position you hold, then distributing the investment seems a little silly. I think if you're going to hold on to that as intellectual property, then the investment falls on the innovator. But I'll defer to other experts in the.
So there are some efforts underway. I know through GDUFA, OGD has supported developing basic platform models for the female reproductive tract, for example. I can't say a whole lot more. It's going to be publicly presented at ASCPT, I guess, and then at FDA in May, at the end of April, actually. But these are open source. They're not meant to be polished, means anybody can use them. Anybody can take advantage of the findings. There have been significant clinical measures incorporated into this with the thinking that they will provide the basis, like a platform basis for assessing various different types of compounds for different complex kind of approaches to complex formulation approaches, for example. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is also continuing to support the extension of these models to be deposited in public repositories. And whoever's going to use them, I mean, PKSM can grab the information. Certara, whoever wants it, can have it once it's vetted and posted. But those are at least a few that I'm aware of, and they've been mechanisms. They've been funded through the broad agency applications. And actually, Mark and I had the Pi Darwin was well, we've been doing that for free for 20 plus years, but finally the open source machine learning code was supported by FDA and is deposited on GitHub for anyone to implement.
Are people going to be able to look under the hood of those models and completely open source? That's really exciting. Thank you, everybody.